Stage is yours, Matt.
Cool. So, a dialogue with the Tao, Taoism and contemplative psychotherapy. So, I decided to go into the kind of the current paradigm of contemplative psychotherapy and what Taoism has to offer it. My thesis was titled, or is titled, The Way of the 10,000 Things, Contemplative Psychotherapy and Taoist Philosophy. So if you dig this presentation and you want to take a look at the actual paper, which kind of goes into some of this in more depth, just let me know. I'll put my email in the comments afterwards. So all right. So this is kind of what I'm going to be going over today. I'm just going to introduce kind of who I am, where I'm coming from in regards to this topic, and then going into kind of the key aspects or fields that I looked at within my thesis, and then diving right into what Taoism has to offer to the field of contemplative psychotherapy. All right, so I am a queer white guy from Texas and Wyoming primarily. But I was first introduced to Buddhism and Taoism in 2001 when I was about 11 years old. At that time, I began studying them pretty fervently. I was rather enthralled by them both, and they've kind of built my spiritual practice since then until now. In 2015, so about 5 years ago, I started practicing yoga regularly. And then when I came to Naropa in 2017, I began practicing Tai Chi underneath Larry Welsh at Naropa, who's an excellent professor. And he teaches the Yang style short form developed by Cheng-Men Cheng, who's this very smiley man over here. And then I am graduating this semester with a bachelor's in psychology, health and healing concentration, which is kind of a combination of somatic therapy, alternative medicines, and Western psychotherapy. A bachelor's in yoga studies, and I'm also getting my yoga teacher training certification. So that's kind of where I am as far as all of this is concerned. So. All right, so the three main topics that I tackled in my thesis were contemplative psychotherapy, contemplative psychology, and Taoism. So contemplative psychotherapy is a practical approach to therapy. So it's actually doing therapy between a therapist and a client. It really traces its roots back to Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche and the founding of Naropa University. It's mostly sourced from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And basically when Trungpa came to the United States and was teaching a Western audience, he decided to filter his teachings through psychology. So this new kind of way of practicing psychotherapy developed from that. About, I think, like a decade after that started to really formulate, a man by the name of Han F. DeWitt came around. He was involved with Naropa as well. He was a psychologist, and he developed the field of contemplative psychology. And contemplative psychology is essentially looking at how different religions and spiritual traditions view the psyche and the mind and all of that jazz. So psychotherapy and the contemplative side of things is very much focused on Buddhist thought, whereas contemplative psychology is focused on a wealth of different traditions. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there, which is totally fine, but I have been in the mindset that contemplative psychotherapy as a practice could actually utilize a lot of what is present in the field of contemplative psychology, and I talk about that through Taoism. So Taoism is kind of a philosophy, a religion, a healthcare system, and a science. It's very kind of polyvalent tradition in many ways. So it's probably most recognizable to y'all through the yin-yang symbol, or what's called the Taiji 2 diagram. The tradition itself, though, dates back about 2,500 years. So it's around the same age as like Buddhism and Jainism. And it's actually a combination of kind of two thought streams. So the first is a much older tradition, which is these shamanic traditions indigenous to China that had been around for at least 5,000 years. And then it was also informed by philosophers from the Warring States period, which was in the mid 200s or mid 400s to mid 200s BCE. And these philosophers were essentially a counter movement to Confucian thought. So Confucianism is kind of very rigid, it's very patriarchal, very much concerned with government and acting in accordance to government and having like a very good ruler and these things. Whereas the Taoist philosophers were like, whoa, we want to be more in sync with nature and harmonizing with nature and yin and yang and these things. So I'm going to touch on just a couple key aspects of Taoism because I don't have time to explain the fullness of the tradition, obviously. So the Tao of Taoism is often translated as the way, and it's this ineffable force that makes up all of reality. So even calling it the Tao is like making it this conceptual thing, and it's beyond concept. So it's one of those fun things that most of us are familiar with from Buddhist psychology. Another aspect of Taoism is the balancing of yin and yang, which are like the first two elements that arise from the Tao, and then from those two things comes everything else. They're inseparable from one another, and their balance, the balance between them is referred to as wu wei, which is sometimes translated as effortless effort or inaction. And then the third thing is harmony with nature. So as I was saying, the philosophers who developed this tradition are really concerned with being in sync with kind of the natural flow of the seasons and, harvest and all of these things. And they basically viewed the universe as kind of this macrocosm and then humanity as a microcosm. So the Taoist understanding of health can be described as, or of illness rather, can be described through kind of one of three different things or a combination of the three. So Dr. Catherine Tianlun's son, who's the head of the Department of Counseling and Psychology at Hong Kong Shui-Yan University, has described Taoist medicine as viewing emotional disorders are deemed to be caused by the loss of dynamic balance between yin and yang in at least one of three levels: within the body and the mind, between the body and the mind, or between nature and the mind-body composite. So again, there's this real emphasis on bringing things into union with one another, balancing things out, having a healthy balance between, the mind-body relationship, and then with the mind-body and what's outside in the world around us. So, all right. Just really quick on the ineffable quality of Taoism, because I want to drive that home. This is an excerpt from the Tao Te Ching as translated by Ursula K. Le Guin. And this is just describing what the Tao is. So, the way you can go isn't the real way. The name you can say isn't the real name. Heaven and earth begin in the unnamed. Name's the mother of the 10,000 things. So the unwanting soul sees what's hidden, and the ever-wanting soul sees only what it wants. Two things, one origin, but different in name, whose identity is mystery, mystery of all mysteries, the door to the hidden. So this is just speaking to that, like, you can try to name and figure out what the Tao is all day long, but you're never going to, and it's kind of pointless to try. It just is what it is, All right, so what does Taoism have to offer the field of contemplative psychotherapy? So the first main thing that I have found is that there are a wealth of somatic practices that can be utilized in a contemplative way that are rooted in Taoism. So the three key ones are Qigong, which most people have probably heard of, Tai Chi, which again, most people have probably heard of, and then Bagua Zheng, which is a slightly more unknown one, but it's also this kind of slow contemplative martial art. So these all are focused on cultivating mindfulness, generating energy, and they can actually be used to work with somatic trauma. And there's actually been studies on specifically Qigong and Tai Chi and their use in treating trauma and various other mental health concerns. Taoism is also the foundation for traditional Chinese medicine, which combines things like acupuncture, herbal medicine, and nutrition. We also know that acupuncture has been shown to be effective in enhancing psychotherapy for various conditions, and diet's also incredibly important in maintaining good mental health for most individuals. The stomach is the location, the second largest location of neurons in the body, and we now know that through the vagal nerve system that kind of what's going on in the gut can have a lot of impact on our mood and what's going on in, you know, our perceived mind and in the brain. So there's also a lot of opportunities for training and developing for therapists. So one of the key aspects of Taoism is nonviolence, which I think is so important to the client-therapist relationship, that the therapist isn't like pushing anything on the client or acting in any kind of like violent way. And that can look a lot of different ways. I'm not talking about like punching people necessarily, but just superimposing one's ideals onto someone else and like trying to form them or force their path. One of the strengths of contemplative psychotherapy is that it's not really reliant on a specific method or technique. It's really free form. So the therapist isn't trying to fit the client into any particular box. They're just trusting the client's organic process. But the downside is that the toolbox is pretty much limited to Buddhist techniques for doing that. And there isn't a lot of training outside of kind of what we get to look at in our undergraduate program. Additional training has to be kind of sought from other sources. So I did want to read just the Chinese Hippocratic Oath, which is rooted in Taoism, because I think it really speaks to qualities that I think every therapist should embody. So it says, a great physician should not pay attention to status, wealth, or age. Neither should they question whether the particular person is attractive or unattractive, whether they are an enemy or a friend, whether they are Chinese or a foreigner, or finally, whether they are uneducated or educated. They should meet everyone on equal grounds. They should always act as if they were thinking of their close relatives. So that really like drives home kind of their worldview as far as treating people from a health perspective. And then the final aspect that I'm focusing on is Chinese 5-element theory. So contemplative psychotherapy currently has a 5-element theory through the Maitri practice of the 5 wisdom energies or 5 Buddha families. But the Chinese 5-element system is actually a little bit more expansive because it's looking at not only the psychology of a person, but it also looks at the physiology of a person and how the 5 elements are represented in nature, and then how all of those things work and impact one another. So I'm just going to dive in to the 5 elements briefly to show you all kind of what they are and some of the key emotions and physiology that are associated with each one. Before I get into that, just I think a useful aphorism to keep in mind whenever you're looking at a model for like personality particularly is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that this one does have a lot of use and practicality to it. So the first element is water. It's associated with the emotion of fear. The officials or the organs it's associated with are the bladder and the kidneys. And it has qualities of storage, holding dormancy, and tapping into ancestral energy. Next is wood, which is associated with anger, the liver and the gallbladder, and is all about birth, growth, rising, and flexibility in life. Fire, which is associated with joy or absence, and it has 4 officials. So the heart, the small intestine, the pericardium, which is the heart protection muscle, and then the sanjiao, which isn't a muscle or organ in the body. It's san is the Chinese word for 3, and jiao is heater. So in Chinese medicine, there's this idea that we have these 3 kind of heat centers in the torso. that generates the heat that the body needs. And the qualities of the fire element are maturation, expansion, brilliance, and like this essence of kind of ruling, not in like a totalitarian way, though it can kind of be like that in a more encumbered form, but more of just having a really solid root in the center and knowing your body and listening to the body. Then we have earth, which is focused on sympathy. The organs are the spleen and the stomach. It's associated with harvest, ripening, balance, and abundance. And then we have metal, which is associated with grief. Its organs are the lungs and the colon. And the qualities of it are letting go, contraction, dropping or falling away. There's also a sense of structure and reverence and like honor involved in this element. So the 5 elements altogether make up the Wu Jing. That just means 5 elements in Chinese. And this little diagram just shows kind of how they interact with one another. So kind of going around in a circle, you can see like water can lead to wood, wood leads to fire, fire leads to earth, earth leads to metal. And then the red arrows kind of demonstrate how they control one another. So water can control fire, fire can control metal, like melting it down or refining it. Metal can chop wood, wood can break through earth, and then earth can like dam or muddy up water. So there's this really dynamic process happening here. There's a lot of resources which I'll show you at the end about this system that are excellent and already written, so I'm not going to go too far into that. All right, so I just want to do a quick experiential and then I'll wrap up here. So this is a Bagua symbol. It's the yin yang surrounded by the 8 gua, or the 8 trigrams. So if you notice here, the white space, which represents yang, if there was no yin, which is the black, if there was no yin on it, then it would just be a blank piece of paper. Like there's no contrast, there would be nothing to distinguish it. So the white yang space is able to stand out because of the black yin space, and vice versa. One doesn't exist without the other. They can't be perceived without having one another to contrast. So if you can all just close your eyes and kind of refresh your posture, lengthening through your spine, noticing your breath. And then try to call into mind an emotion that you experience as being difficult. It doesn't need to be anything super deep, but maybe you struggle with like feelings of sadness or frustration. Maybe it's annoyance or boredom, but something that is fairly common that you're like, I don't really like that emotional experience. So once you have that kind of pesky emotion in your body somewhere, ask yourself, what do you perceive to be its opposite? So what is the opposite of that pesky emotion? It might be joy, it could be calm, it might be excitement and wonder, but whatever it is, just call into mind that positive kind of polar opposite of whatever the negative emotion is. So once you have both of those kind of hanging out in your system and you're like, okay, yeah, that one's good, this one's bad, ask yourself if it is possible to really experience and appreciate the desirable or that positive emotion without having experienced the pesky one. So maybe your answer is like, yeah, I could totally appreciate just the good stuff, screw that bad stuff, I don't want to deal with that. But in my experience, it's often the case that I don't think I would have an appreciation or such a reverence or depth of experience of my positive emotions if I didn't have the contrast of the negative ones. Just like yang can't exist without yin and vice versa, the perceived negative and the perceived positive don't really exist without one another. So you can open your eyes, you can let those emotions go, but maybe just hold for yourself, throughout the rest of your day or maybe the rest of the week. If you happen to encounter like a negative emotion, what gift does it give you to appreciate as far as a positive emotion is concerned? And for me, that's been a really transformative process in how I work with my own emotions. So, alrighty. So, continuing the conversation. So I chose to focus on Taoism for my project because it's the core of my personal practice. But there are so many contemplative traditions. As I said, contemplative psychology has looked at many of these that have something to offer to the conversation. So everything from yoga to Sufism to contemplative Christianity, indigenous religions of all kinds. There's so much out there. That we can utilize in kind of expanding contemplative psychotherapy from just this Buddhist perspective to something much more vast. And I think that's important because it opens the door to therapists who maybe don't identify with Buddhist thought or don't really get it. And it also opens the door for all contemplative psychotherapists to kind of pull these practices from different traditions to reach different clients, and really expands our ability to help people from a variety of backgrounds, whether they're Buddhist or Christian, or they don't identify as any particular spirituality. So that is pretty much all I have. I don't know how much time I have left, but here's some further reading and resources, and I am open for questions if I have time for them. So.
Nice work, Matt. We have time for one question, I'd say.
Matt, did you do those watercolors?
Yeah, all the art except for the photograph of Professor Cheng is mine. So.
So beautiful. I love the phoenix.
Oh, thank you.
I have one question for you, Matt.
Yeah.
I have the privilege of having read your paper, so I have a broader context. And I'm just considering Trungpa's dissemination of a Shambhala approach was really, in my understanding and view, a adaptation of Buddhist traditions to be more met to a secular audience. And I'm curious just to hear a quick response from you, what you think Trungpa would have thought about the integration that you're proposing.
Sure. I mean, what I would like to think is that he would be super into this. Just because, like, when he was founding Naropa with all the different folks he was doing that with, like, there were artists and poets and, these psychologists, all these different walks of life coming together. And Naropa in its foundation had a lot of different traditions represented, including Taoism. And Naropa's actually kind of lost a lot of its Taoist traditions and roots in the last few years, which I'd really like to see come back. But I think that he would think that, like, this message of, like, inclusion and bringing, like, mindfulness and contemplative practice and this union with nature, I think he would be really into that. In Taoism, like, humans are often looked at as, like, stewards or protectors of the earth, and I think that really aligns with the message of Shambhala as far as I understand it. So.
Great, thanks for that answer and sharing a little bit there. And I'm in complete agreement with you. I think it's a really creative and unique topic that you approached, and I think you did a phenomenal job both in your presentation and certainly in your manuscript, which just really shines. Great work.
Thank you. Oh, here's references, but all right.
Congrats, Matt.
Thank you.